The late summer sun painted the Arizona territory in hues of gold and amber. As Clara Zimmerman stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her modest room above Lordsburg's only millinery shop. Her eyes, once vibrant with hope, now carried the weight of broken promises and a heart that had been shattered one too many times. 1874 had not been kind to her, but she was determined that 1875 would be different, very different. Clara pinned her chestnut hair into a practical bun, ignoring the few strands that refused to be tamed. At 25, she was already considered by many in Lordsburg to be headed firmly toward spinsterhood. Not that she cared anymore. After burying her father last winter, enduring a broken engagement to the town banker's son, who'd been secretly courting the sheriff's daughter simultaneously, and then having her modest inheritance swindled by a silver-tongued investor passing through town, Clara had made a solemn vow to herself. "No more," she whispered to her reflection, squaring her shoulders with renewed determination. "I am done with love and done with trusting men with smooth words and empty promises." She descended the narrow staircase that led directly to Mrs. Holloway's millinery shop below. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, the familiar scent of fabric and ribbons greeting her. "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," Clara called out, reaching for her apron hanging on a peg near the counter. The older woman looked up from her work, her fingers pausing over an elaborate hat adorned with peacock feathers. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep any better last night?" Clara shook her head. "Not particularly, but I'll manage." She began arranging the display of ladies' gloves that had arrived on yesterday's stagecoach. "Well, perhaps a bit of news will brighten your spirits. The Wilson Ranch has a new foreman." Mrs. Holloway's eyes twinkled with unmistakable matchmaking intent. "Apparently, he's quite the gentleman, despite being a cowboy. Educated back east, they say." Clara sighed. "Mrs. Holloway, I appreciate your concern, but I've told you I'm not interested in meeting any men, regardless of their education or how gentlemanly they might appear." The older woman clucked her tongue. "Clara Zimmerman, you're far too young to be so bitter. Not all men are like Jonathan Pierce or that snake oil salesman who took your money." "I'm not bitter," Clara replied, though she knew the words rang hollow. "I'm practical. Focusing on building something for myself now." Mrs. Holloway opened her mouth to argue further but was interrupted by the shop door opening. The sun silhouetted the tall figure of a man Clara had never seen before. As he stepped fully into the shop, removing his hat in one fluid motion, Clara found herself momentarily stunned by the intensity of his clear green eyes. "Ladies," he greeted them, his voice a deep baritone with a hint of a southern drawl. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Mrs." Holloway practically sang, shooting Clara a meaningful look. "How may we help you, sir?" "Ethan Quinn," he introduced himself with a slight bow of his head. "New foreman at the Wilson place. I'm looking for something suitable for Mrs. Wilson's birthday." "Mr. Wilson suggested I might find a nice bonnet or perhaps some gloves here." Clara stood frozen, clutching a pair of cream-colored gloves so tightly her knuckles turned white. There was something disarming about the man, perhaps the way he held himself with quiet confidence or the genuine warmth in his smile. A dangerous combination, her mind warned. "Miss Zimmerman here is our expert on gloves," Mrs. Holloway said, practically pushing Clara forward. "She'll help you select something perfect." Ethan Quinn turned his attention to Clara, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Zimmerman, I'd be grateful for your assistance." Clara cleared her throat, placing the gloves she'd been strangling back on the display. "What color is Mrs. Wilson's favorite dress?" she asked, all business, refusing to acknowledge the flutter in her stomach when his fingers briefly brushed hers as she showed him different options. "A deep blue, I believe." "Like the sky just after sunset," he answered, surprising her with the poetic description. For the next 20 minutes, Clara helped Ethan select a pair of fine blue kid gloves with pearl buttons. Throughout their interaction, she maintained a polite but distant demeanor, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's not-so-subtle attempts to prolong the conversation. As she wrapped his purchase in tissue paper, Ethan leaned slightly on the counter. "Miss Zimmerman, would you perhaps consider joining me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Quinn, while I appreciate the invitation, I must decline. May I ask why?" His question was gentle, curious rather than offended. Clara tied the string around the package with more force than necessary. "Because, Mr. Quinn, I'm done with romantic entanglements, completely done. I find them unnecessarily complicated and inevitably disappointing." To her surprise, Ethan Quinn didn't look discouraged. Instead, a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Then perhaps, Miss Zimmerman, you simply haven't encountered the right kind of entanglement. I assure you, Mr. Quinn, I've encountered enough to last a lifetime." She handed him his package, chin raised defiantly. He accepted it with a nod, placing his hat back on his head. "You know what I think, Miss Zimmerman?" he asked, heading toward the door. "I'm sure I couldn't begin to guess," she replied dryly. He paused at the threshold, the sunlight once again silhouetting his tall frame. "I think you're a woman who's been hurt, and that's a terrible shame. But if you're truly done with love, as you say—" He tipped his hat, his eyes holding an unmistakable challenge. "Then let me change your mind." Slowly. Before Clara could formulate a reply, he was gone, leaving only the gentle sway of the shop door in his wake. Mrs. Holloway's delighted gasp broke the silence. "Well, if that isn't the most romantic thing I've ever heard in all my 62 years." Clara shook her head, trying to dispel the warmth that had crept into her cheeks. "Romantic. It's presumptuous, is what it is." Yet as she returned to arranging gloves, Clara couldn't help but wonder what exactly Ethan Quinn had meant by slowly. And why, despite her better judgment, she was curious to find out. 3 days passed without any sign of Ethan Quinn in Lordsburg proper. Clara told herself she wasn't keeping track and certainly wasn't disappointed. She was busy with the new shipment of fall hats and helping Mrs. Holloway prepare for the upcoming Harvest Festival. On the 4th day, just as Clara was locking up the shop, she spotted a familiar figure across the street, speaking with Sheriff Taylor. Ethan Quinn wore simple work clothes covered in dust, evidence of a hard day's labor at the Wilson Ranch. Even from a distance, something about his presence commanded attention. Clara quickly turned away, pretending she hadn't seen him, and headed toward the general store to pick up the thread Mrs. Holloway had requested. She was halfway there when she heard her name. "Miss Zimmerman." She considered pretending she hadn't heard, but such rudeness wasn't in her nature, no matter how determined she was to avoid entanglements. With a resigned sigh, she stopped and turned. Ethan crossed the street, navigating around a loaded wagon with ease. "Good evening, Miss Zimmerman." "Heading home. Errands," she replied shortly, gesturing vaguely toward the general store. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Quinn, I've been thinking about our conversation," he interrupted, falling into step beside her. "And I realized I might have been too forward." That caught her attention. "Oh, yes. Asking you to dinner without properly introducing myself was presumptuous." He smiled, and Clara couldn't help noticing how it transformed his whole face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "So I thought perhaps we could start again. My name is Ethan Quinn, originally from Virginia. I fought for the Union, studied agriculture at a college in Pennsylvania after the war, and have spent the last 5 years working ranches from Texas to here. Despite herself, Clara was intrigued. That's quite a journey. Life rarely follows a straight trail, he said, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality. I suspect you understand that better than most. Clara bristled slightly. You don't know anything about my life, Mr. Quinn. True enough, he conceded easily, but I'd like to learn if you'd allow it. They reached the general store and Clara paused at the entrance. Mr. Quinn, I appreciate your interest, but as I told you before, you're done with love, he finished for her, nodding. I remember, but what about friendship? Surely you haven't sworn off that as well. Clara narrowed her eyes, suspicious. Friendship? Yes, Miss Zimmerman, friendship, conversation, perhaps the occasional game of checkers or a walk through town. His expression remained earnest. Nothing more unless you decide otherwise. Clara studied him, searching for signs of deception. She'd become quite skilled at detecting men's ulterior motives, but Ethan Quinn's green eyes held nothing but sincerity. One walk, she found herself saying. Tomorrow after church, as friends. His smile widened. I look forward to it, Miss Zimmerman. As promised, Ethan was waiting outside the small white clapboard church the following day. Clara emerged from the service to find him engaged in conversation with several of Lordsburg's prominent citizens, including Mr. Wilson, his employer. She hesitated, momentarily tempted to slip away. Ah, here she is, Mr. Wilson boomed, noticing her. Miss Zimmerman, our Ethan here has been singing your praises regarding those gloves you helped him select. Martha absolutely adores them. Clara smiled politely. I'm pleased Mrs. Wilson enjoys them. Ethan stepped forward, looking quite different in his Sunday clothes, a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. Ready for our walk, Miss Zimmerman, she nodded, acutely aware of the curious glances being exchanged among the churchgoers. Gossip traveled faster than wildfire in Lordsburg, and by supper time, everyone would be speculating about Clara Zimmerman walking out with the new ranch foreman. They strolled down Main Street, past the hotel and saloon, toward the small park at the edge of town. For a while neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like a physical thing. So, Ethan finally said, what brought you to Lordsburg? Clara considered deflecting the question but decided that harmless facts couldn't hurt. My father. He was a mining engineer. We came west after my mother died, hoping for a fresh start. He had dreams of striking it rich. A sad smile touched her lips, like so many others. And did he strike it rich? Clara shook her head. No, he found enough to keep us comfortable, but nothing like the fortune he'd hoped for. He passed last winter pneumonia. I'm sorry, Ethan said, his voice gentle. Losing a parent leaves a void nothing else can fill. Something in his tone made Clara glance at him. You speak from experience, he nodded. Lost both my parents within a year of each other. Father to a heart ailment, mother to grief shortly after. I was 19. That's very young to be alone in the world, Clara said softly. As is 24, he countered, surprising her that he'd correctly guessed her age. 25, actually, she corrected. My apologies, Miss Zimmerman. 25, he said with a small smile. A quarter-century of life experience. That's nothing to dismiss. They reached the park, where a few families were enjoying the pleasant Sunday afternoon. Ethan guided them toward an empty bench beneath a cottonwood tree. May I ask you something, Miss Zimmerman? He said once they were seated, a respectable distance between them. Clara tensed slightly. You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer, he chuckled. Fair enough. I was wondering what made you decide to stay in Lordsburg after your father passed. Many young women might have returned east to family or sought opportunities in larger cities. It was a perceptive question, one that Clara had asked herself many times during those dark days after her father's death. "Lordsburg is home now," she replied after a moment. "Mrs. Holloway has been like family to me, and I've invested what savings I have in the shop. She's promised me partnership when she retires." She paused. "Besides, there's nothing for me back east. No family, no connections worth pursuing." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Building something of your own, that's admirable." "And you?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. "What brought you to Arizona territory? Surely there are ranches closer to Virginia." A shadow passed over his face briefly. "I needed distance. After the war, Virginia felt haunted. Too many ghosts walking those hills." He looked out over the park, his gaze distant. "I headed west, like so many others, looking for open space and maybe a chance to be defined by something other than where I was born and which side I fought for." Clara studied his profile, seeing for the first time the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of hardship endured. She'd assumed him to be perhaps 30, but now wondered if he might be older. "How old are you, Mr. Quinn?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its propriety. 33, he answered without hesitation. "Ancient by some standards, I suppose." "Hardly," Clara said with the ghost of a smile, "though certainly old enough to have acquired wisdom." "Some would debate that," he replied with a self-deprecating laugh. "I've made my share of foolish choices." Their conversation continued. Touching on books they'd read, Clara was surprised to discover Ethan's fondness for Dickens. Places they'd seen. His descriptions of the Texas plains made her yearn to travel. And childhood memories. Both had climbed trees they weren't supposed to and suffered similar consequences. When the church bell tolled 4 times, Clara started in surprise. "Goodness! I had no idea it was so late. I promised Mrs. Holloway I'd help her prepare for tomorrow's inventory." They walked back toward town, their pace unhurried despite Clara's statement. At the stairs leading up to her rooms above the millinery, Ethan stopped. "Thank you for the walk, Miss Zimmerman. I enjoyed our conversation." Clara found herself nodding. "As did I, Mr. Quinn. It was pleasant. Pleasant enough to consider another. Perhaps a ride out to see the wildflowers near Echo Canyon next Sunday." His expression was hopeful but not demanding. Clara hesitated. She had enjoyed their time together far more than she'd anticipated. Ethan Quinn was unlike the men she'd known before, thoughtful, direct, and seemingly without artifice. But that made him dangerous in a different way. "Just as friends," she clarified, needing to establish the boundary as much for herself as for him. "Just as friends," he agreed, though something in his eyes suggested patience rather than resignation. As Clara climbed the stairs to her room, she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But for the first time in months, she also felt a flicker of something that might have been anticipation. The following week passed in a blur of activity. The Harvest Festival Committee had selected the millinery shop to create decorative bunting for the town square, keeping Clara and Mrs. Holloway working late into the evenings. Clara welcomed the distraction, trying not to dwell on thoughts of her upcoming Sunday outing with Ethan. She saw him twice during the week, once at the general store, where they exchanged brief pleasantries while others were present, and once when he stopped by the shop to deliver a small package from Mrs. Wilson. Both times, he was unfailingly polite but made no attempts to press for more of her time than she offered. Sunday morning dawned clear and mild. Clara dressed with more care than she wanted to admit, selecting a practical riding skirt and jacket in a shade of blue that she knew complemented her eyes. She arranged her hair in a simple but neat chignon that would fit beneath a hat and added a touch of rose water purely because it was Sunday. She told herself, not because she was meeting Ethan Quinn. He was waiting outside her building with 2 horses when she descended the stairs, a sturdy bay gelding for himself, and a gentle-looking dappled mare for her. "Good morning, Miss Zimmerman." He greeted her with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I borrowed Daisy here from the Wilsons. Mrs. Wilson assured me she's the gentlest mount in their stable." Clara approached the mare, who nuzzled her hand curiously. "She's beautiful. It's been some time since I've ridden, though." "Daisy will take good care of you," Ethan assured her, offering his cupped hands to help her mount. Clara hesitated only briefly before placing her boot in his hands and allowing him to boost her onto the saddle. His strength was evident in how effortlessly he lifted her, but his touch remained respectful. They rode at a leisurely pace out of town, heading east toward the foothills where Echo Canyon cut through the rocky terrain. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, though the sky remained clear. Clara found her riding skills returning quickly, and she relaxed into the gentle rhythm of Daisy's gait. "You ride well," Ethan observed after they'd covered a mile or so. "Your father taught you," Clara nodded. "He believed women should know how to ride and shoot, practical skills for frontier living, he called them. A progressive thinker." "In some ways," Clara agreed, "though he'd have been scandalized to see me riding astride rather than side saddle." Ethan chuckled. "Times change. Practicality wins out over propriety in the territories. And what about you, Mr. Quinn? Are you scandalized by a woman in a split riding skirt?" Clara surprised herself with the teasing tone that crept into her voice. "Not in the least, Miss Zimmerman," he replied with a grin. "I find capability far more appealing than adherence to outdated conventions." They continued riding, the conversation flowing more easily than Clara had expected. Ethan told her about his work at the Wilson Ranch, his plans for improving the cattle breeding program, the challenges of water management in the arid landscape, his respect for the ranch hands who worked alongside him. "You speak about ranching with such passion," Clara observed. "Have you ever considered having a place of your own?" A wistful expression crossed his face. "It's always been the dream. A modest spread, good water rights, enough cattle to build a future on." He looked out toward the distant mountains. "I've been saving. Another year or two, I might have enough for a small homestead claim. Here in Arizona Territory. I've grown fond of it," he said, his gaze returning to her. "The land has a stark beauty that gets under your skin." They reached a plateau overlooking a sweeping valley, dotted with the yellow and purple blooms Ethan had promised. Echo Canyon carved through the landscape below, its walls rising dramatically on either side of a ribbon of green that marked a seasonal creek. "It's breathtaking," Clara murmured as they dismounted to rest the horses. Ethan spread a small blanket on a flat rock and produced a canteen of water and a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might be hungry. It's nothing fancy, just some bread, cheese, and apples." Clara accepted the simple offering with genuine appreciation. They sat side by side, though not too close, gazing out at the panoramic view as they ate. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Zimmerman?" Ethan said after a comfortable silence. Clara tensed slightly but nodded. "What happened to make you declare yourself done with love? It seems a definitive stance for someone so young." Clara stared down at the remains of her apple, considering how much to reveal. "The usual story, I suppose. I trusted unwisely, more than once." "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Was it recent?" "Recent enough," she admitted. "After my father died, there was a man, Jonathan Pierce, the banker's son. He courted me for several months, made promises." She swallowed hard. "I later discovered he was simultaneously courting the sheriff's daughter. Apparently, he was waiting to see which of us would receive a larger inheritance before making his final choice." Ethan's expression darkened. "That's despicable." "Yes, Well, Abigail Taylor won that particular contest, Clara said with forced lightness. Though I hear she's since broken their engagement. Seems I wasn't the only one he was courting on the side. And was there someone else? Ethan asked carefully. Clara sighed. After Jonathan, a businessman passed through town, Randall Smith. He had investment opportunities in silver mines near Tucson. Very exclusive opportunities, he claimed. Her cheeks burned with the memory of her gullibility. I invested what remained of my inheritance. He disappeared 2 days later with everyone's money. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I understand why you'd be cautious after such experiences. But not everyone is like Jonathan Pierce or Randall Smith. Perhaps not, Clara conceded. But I've found that starting from a position of distrust saves considerable heartache. And I've discovered something else, Mr. Quinn. What's that? I don't need a man to build a life worth living. She met his gaze directly. I have plans for the millinery. Mrs. Holloway is teaching me everything she knows. In a few years, when she retires, I'll expand the business. Perhaps add dressmaking services or open a proper ladies' department store. Ethan studied her face. That sounds like a fine ambition, Miss Zimmerman, and one you're clearly capable of achieving. He smiled slightly. But it doesn't preclude other possibilities in life, does it? Other possibilities come with risks I'm no longer willing to take, she replied firmly. All worthwhile things involve risk, he countered gently. Even your business plans. Before Clara could respond, a distant rumble drew their attention to the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering with surprising speed. We should head back, Ethan said, rising quickly and offering her his hand. Arizona storms can move fast, and I don't like the look of those clouds. They packed up hastily and remounted. What had been a pleasant breeze was rapidly becoming a gusty wind, and the temperature was dropping noticeably. Clara pulled her jacket closer as they urged the horses into a faster pace. They were still several miles from town when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the scattered drops became a steady downpour. There's a lined shack just over that rise. Ethan called over the increasing roar of the rain. We can wait it out there. Clara nodded, already soaked to the skin and shivering. They crested the small hill to find a simple wooden structure nestled against a stand of juniper trees. By the time they'd secured the horses under a lean-to at the side of the shack, both Clara and Ethan were drenched. The shack was sparse but sound, a single room with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Ethan immediately set about starting a fire in the stove while Clara stood dripping and uncertain in the middle of the room. You should get out of those wet clothes, Ethan said matter-of-factly. There's probably a blanket in that trunk, and I'll turn my back while you change. Clara hesitated, but another violent shiver convinced her of the wisdom of his suggestion. She found a rough wool blanket in the trunk he'd indicated and waited until Ethan had his back turned before quickly removing her soaked jacket, blouse, and skirt, leaving only her damp chemise and petticoat. She wrapped the blanket around herself like a shawl. I'm decent, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned, his own clothes plastered to his frame. He'd removed his jacket and hung it near the stove but otherwise remained fully dressed. I'll hang these to dry, he said, carefully taking her wet garments and arranging them on the backs of the chairs near the now crackling fire. Thank you, Clara managed through chattering teeth. Ethan looked at her with concern. You're freezing. Here. He guided her to sit on the edge of the cot, then wrapped a second blanket he'd found around her shoulders. The stove will warm the place soon enough. Clara nodded, too cold to maintain her usual reserve. The The shack was small enough that even with the minimal fire, it began to warm quickly. Ethan busied himself investigating the shelves, eventually producing a tin of coffee and a small pot. "Looks like we'll have something hot to drink soon," he said, setting the pot of water on the stove. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the single window and wind howling through the juniper trees. Clara gradually stopped shivering as the warmth from the stove permeated the small space. "I'm sorry about this," Ethan said, sitting at the table across from where she perched on the cot. "I should have paid more attention to the weather signs." "It's not your fault," Clara assured him. "These summer storms can appear with little warning." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Clara found herself studying Ethan as he prepared the coffee, the careful precision of his movements, the strength evident in his forearms as he rolled up his damp sleeves, the way his dark hair curled slightly when wet. He caught her watching and smiled. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Zimmerman." Clara looked away, embarrassed. "I was just thinking that this wasn't quite how I expected our outing to end." "No," he agreed with a soft laugh. "Not quite according to plan, though I can't say I mind the company despite the circumstances." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to Clara, careful to maintain a respectful distance as he handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through Clara that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the cup. Ethan returned to his seat at the table. "May I ask you something, Clara?" It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. She nodded hesitantly. "What would it take?" "To change your mind about love?" His question was soft, almost tentative. Clara stared into her coffee, considering how to answer. "I don't know that anything could," she finally replied. "When you've been made a fool of repeatedly, you learn to protect yourself." "Not all love makes fools of people," Ethan said. "Sometimes it makes them stronger, braver, more themselves than they ever were alone." "That sounds like something from a novel," Clara responded, though without the sharpness she might have intended. "Perhaps," he conceded with a slight smile. "But I've seen it. My parents had that kind of love. My father was a better man because my mother loved him and she bloomed under his devotion. When he died, it was as if half of her died with him." "That's precisely what I fear," Clara admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "Becoming so entwined with another person that losing them destroys you." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It's a risk, certainly, but consider the alternative: never experiencing that depth of connection at all, never knowing what it's like to be truly seen and accepted by another soul." He paused. "Which is the greater tragedy?" Clara had no immediate answer. They sat in contemplative silence as the storm continued outside, though the fury of it seemed to be lessening somewhat. "Tell me about your dreams," Ethan said eventually. "Beyond the millinery. If you could have any life you wanted, what would it look like?" The question caught Clara off guard. Few people had ever asked about her dreams, assuming that a woman's aspirations extended no further than marriage and children. She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I'd like to travel," she began slowly. "See San Francisco, Chicago, New York, maybe even Europe someday. I'd like to build a business that's truly mine, something that might outlast me." She hesitated. "And I'd like a home, not just rooms I rent, but a real home with a garden and bookshelves filled with books I've actually had time to read." Ethan smiled. "Those sound like worthy dreams, Clara. And you?" she asked. "Beyond your own ranch, what do you dream of?" His expression grew thoughtful. "Peace, I suppose. The war left scars that aren't always visible. I dream of quiet evenings and mornings without nightmares." He looked down at his hands. Family, children, passing something worthwhile to the next generation. The simple honesty of his answer moved Clara more than she wanted to admit. They continued talking as the storm gradually subsided, sharing stories and thoughts that seemed safer somehow in the isolated intimacy of the lined shack, with rain as a barrier between them and the outside world. When the downpour finally reduced to a gentle patter, Ethan checked their clothes. Still damp, but not soaking anymore. We should probably head back before we lose too much daylight. Clara nodded, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation alone together in this small shack, she in her undergarments beneath a blanket. Yet strangely, she felt no fear in Ethan's presence, only a curious sense of safety she couldn't quite explain. "I'll step outside to check on the horses while you dress," he said, reaching for his still damp jacket. When he returned, Clara was fully dressed, her hair smoothed back as best she could manage without a proper brush. The wet clothes clung uncomfortably, but it was far better than riding back to town in her underclothes. The journey back was quiet, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts. The storm had cleared the air, leaving everything smelling fresh and alive. When they reached the edge of Lordsburg, Clara became acutely aware of the picture they must present, both of them disheveled and damp, returning hours after they'd left. "People will talk," she murmured as they approached the main street. Ethan glanced at her. "Does that concern you?" Clara considered the question. It should. A woman's reputation is fragile in a small town. "We've done nothing wrong," Ethan pointed out. "Seeking shelter from a storm is hardly scandalous. Perception often matters more than reality in places like Lordsburg." Ethan reined his horse to a stop, causing Clara to do the same. "Clara, if anyone suggests anything improper happened today, I'll set them straight immediately. I would never allow your reputation to be damaged by association with me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice stirred something in Clara's chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "Though I suspect Mrs. Holloway will be far more concerned about my catching pneumonia than about any potential scandal." As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Holloway appeared on the boardwalk outside the millinery, her face etched with worry. When she spotted Clara and Ethan, relief washed over her features. "Thank heavens!" she exclaimed as they dismounted. "I was about to ask Sheriff Taylor to form a search party. That storm came up so suddenly." "We're fine, Mrs. Holloway," Clara assured her, accepting Ethan's help down from the saddle despite the watchful eyes of several townspeople who had paused to observe their return. "Mr. Quinn found us shelter until the worst passed." Mrs. Holloway ushered Clara toward the shop. "You need a hot bath and dry clothes immediately, young lady." She glanced back at Ethan. "Thank you for keeping her safe, Mr. Quinn." Ethan tipped his hat. "It was my pleasure, madam." His eyes met Clara's briefly. "Perhaps another outing when the weather is more cooperative, Miss Zimmerman. Though perhaps somewhere closer to town next time." Despite herself, Clara smiled. "Perhaps, Mr. Quinn." As she followed Mrs. Holloway upstairs to her rooms, Clara realized with a jolt that she was already looking forward to seeing Ethan again. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The following days brought whispers and curious glances, as Clara had predicted, but nothing overtly scandalous. Ethan had apparently made a point of speaking with Sheriff Taylor and Mr. Wilson immediately upon his return, explaining exactly what had happened during the storm. Their endorsement of his character and the circumstances served to quell the worst of the gossip. Still, Clara found herself the subject of increased attention, particularly from the town's unmarried women, who seemed eager for details about the handsome ranch foreman. Clara deflected their questions with practiced ease. sharing nothing of the conversations that had passed between them in the lined shack. A week after their rain-soaked adventure, Ethan appeared at the millinery just before closing time. He looked different, somehow freshly shaved, his usually wind-tousled hair neatly combed, wearing a clean shirt and vest rather than his work clothes. "Good evening, Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Holloway's interested presence nearby. "I was hoping I might escort you to the sociable at the church tomorrow evening." Clara hesitated. The monthly sociable was a community gathering music, refreshments, conversation. Attending with Ethan would be a public statement of sorts, one that would fuel the already active rumor mill. "There's to be a debate on the merits of territorial status versus statehood," Ethan added with a smile that suggested he knew exactly how little that topic would interest her. "And Mrs. Wilson mentioned something about her famous apple cake being served." Mrs. Holloway made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed laugh. Clara found herself returning his smile. "Well, I can hardly resist a political debate and apple cake, can I? Thank you, Mr. Quinn. I would be pleased to accompany you." The brightness of Ethan's smile at her acceptance caused an uncomfortable flutter in Clara's chest. "Excellent. Shall I call for you at 6? Clara nodded, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's delighted expression behind Ethan's back. After he left, Mrs. Holloway couldn't contain herself any longer. "Well, it seems Mr. Quinn is quite determined to court you properly, Clara." "It's just a church sociable," Clara protested weakly. "Of course it is, dear," Mrs. Holloway replied with a knowing smile. "Just as that ride last Sunday was just to see the wildflowers. You may have declared yourself done with love, but I don't believe Mr. Quinn has received that particular message." Clara busied herself with straightening the already immaculate counter-display. "We're friends, Mrs. Holloway, nothing more, if you say so, my dear." The older woman patted Clara's hand gently. "But you might want to wear your blue dress tomorrow evening. It brings out your eyes." Despite her protests, Clara did indeed choose her blue dress for the sociable. It was her finest garment, a deep cornflower blue with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and collar. Made from fabric her father had brought back from a trip to California the year before he died. She spent more time than usual arranging her hair, pinning it in a style that softened the angles of her face while remaining properly modest. Ethan arrived precisely at 6, hat in hand, looking so handsome in his Sunday suit that Clara momentarily lost the ability to form coherent thoughts. He offered her his arm with an old-world formality that would have seemed affected coming from anyone else. The church hall was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Heads turned as they entered, and Clara felt the weight of curious stares. Ethan seemed oblivious or perhaps simply unconcerned, guiding her with a gentle hand at her elbow toward where Mrs. Wilson stood proudly beside her famous apple cake. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Quinn, how lovely to see you both," Mrs. Wilson greeted them warmly. "Clara, my dear, that blue is absolutely your color. Doesn't she look radiant, Ethan?" Clara felt heat rising to her cheeks at the older woman's frank assessment and matchmaking transparency. "Radiant indeed," Ethan agreed with a sincerity that only deepened Clara's blush. The evening progressed pleasantly. The promised debate turned out to be more entertaining than Clara had anticipated, with Sheriff Taylor and Mr. Peterson, the newspaper editor, presenting opposing views with good-natured verbal sparring. Ethan remained by Clara's side throughout, attentive but never possessive, including her in conversations with various townspeople but never speaking for her. When the musical portion of the evening began, Clara tensed slightly. Dancing would be another step altogether in whatever was developing between them. "Would you care to dance, Miss Zimmerman?" Ethan asked as the small ensemble struck up a waltz. Or would you prefer to continue our discussion on the future governance of Arizona Territory? The teasing glint in his eyes made Clara laugh despite herself. I believe I've heard quite enough about territorial politics for one evening, Mr. Quinn. He led her onto the dance floor with confidence, his hand warm at her waist, keeping a respectable distance between them as they joined the other couples circling the floor. Clara had learned to dance in finishing school back east, but it had been years since she'd had occasion to use those skills. To her surprise, she remembered the steps easily, falling into rhythm with Ethan's sure lead. "You dance beautifully," he said as they turned gracefully around a corner of the floor. "As do you," she replied, genuinely impressed by his skill. "Not what one expects from a ranch foreman," he smiled. "My mother insisted I learn. Said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in any social situation from ballroom to bunkhouse. A wise woman." "She was," he agreed, a fleeting sadness crossing his features before his smile returned. "She would have liked you, I think. She valued authenticity above all else." The simple compliment touched Clara more deeply than flowery praise might have. They continued to dance in companionable silence, and Clara found herself relaxing into the moment, enjoying the sensation of being led by capable hands, the pleasant scent of Ethan's shaving soap, and the warmth in his eyes when they met hers. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan escorted Clara home, their path lit by the nearly full moon and the occasional lamplight spilling from windows along Main Street. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," Ethan said as they approached the stairs leading to Clara's rooms. "I enjoyed your company immensely." "As did I," Clara admitted. "It was a lovely evening." They stood at the bottom of the stairs, the moment stretching between them. Clara knew that in a proper courtship, this would be when a gentleman might ask permission to call again formally. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "Clara," Ethan began, his voice soft in the quiet night, "I know you've said you're done with love, and I promise to respect that. But I find myself wondering if perhaps you might be reconsidering that position, even slightly." Clara looked down, studying the toes of her best shoes peeking out from beneath her dress. "I'm not sure what I think anymore," she admitted. "You're not what I expected, Ethan Quinn." He smiled at her use of his full name. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "I haven't decided yet," she replied honestly. "Fair enough." He took her hand gently, raising it to his lips for the briefest of kisses that sent a shiver through her entire body. "Good night, Clara Zimmerman." "Sweet dreams." Clara climbed the stairs to her room in a daze, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. As she prepared for bed, she caught herself humming the waltz they had danced to, and the realization brought her up short. "This is dangerous," she whispered to her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. "Guard your heart, Clara, guard your heart." But even as she formed the admonition, she knew it might already be too late. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and preparations for Lordsburg's annual harvest festival. Clara found herself busier than ever at the millinery, yet somehow Ethan managed to become a regular fixture in her life. Sometimes it was just a brief visit to the shop, other times a Sunday afternoon walk or an escort to church events. Each encounter peeled away another layer of Clara's carefully constructed defenses. One crisp Saturday morning, as Clara was arranging a new display of winter bonnets in the shop window, the door opened to admit a breathless Abigail Taylor, the sheriff's daughter and Clara's one-time romantic rival. "Clara, I simply must speak with you," Abigail declared, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Mrs. Holloway had gone to visit her sister in Tucson for the weekend, leaving Clara in charge of the shop. Clara straightened, wary. Her relationship with Abigail had been strained ever since the Jonathan Pierce affair, though neither woman had ever directly addressed it. "What can I help you with, Abigail? We've just received some lovely new ribbon if you're looking to refresh your autumn hat." Abigail waved away the suggestion. "This isn't about hats, Clara. It's about Ethan Quinn." Clara's heart stuttered. "What about Mr. Quinn? You're courting him, aren't you?" Abigail's tone made it more accusation than question. "Mr. Quinn and I are friends," Clara replied carefully. Abigail gave a most unladylike snort. "Please, Clara, everyone in town can see there's more to it than that, the way he looks at you." She trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "That's not why I'm here. I felt I should warn you. Father received a telegraph yesterday from the sheriff in Yuma. He was making inquiries about Quinn." Clara's stomach tightened. "What kind of inquiries?" "It seems Mr. Quinn was involved in some kind of trouble there before coming to Lordsburg. The details weren't clear, but it involved a woman and money gone missing." Abigail leaned closer. "Clara, I know we haven't always been on the best terms, but after what happened with Jonathan and then that awful investment swindler, I couldn't bear to see you hurt again by another dishonest man." Clara's mind raced. Could Ethan be hiding something? The thought chilled her, but she wasn't ready to believe the worst. Not about him. Not without proof. "Thank you for your concern, Abigail," she said stiffly. "If there's any truth to these rumors, I'm sure Sheriff Taylor will handle the matter appropriately." Abigail's expression softened unexpectedly. "Clara, I truly am sorry about Jonathan. I didn't know he was courting you simultaneously. When I found out he was seeing someone else entirely in Tucson, I ended things immediately." The sincere apology caught Clara off guard. "It wasn't your fault," she admitted after a moment. "Jonathan deceived us both." "Yes, well, men can be terribly convincing when they want something," Abigail said with a grimness that suggested hard-won wisdom. "Just be careful with Quinn, for your own sake." After Abigail left, Clara found it impossible to concentrate on her work. What if Ethan was indeed hiding a disreputable past? What if she'd been fooled again by a charming smile and gentle words? The thought was almost too painful to contemplate. By closing time, Clara had made up her mind. She would confront Ethan directly. If there was any truth to the rumors, she wanted to hear his explanation before passing judgment. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As she was locking up the shop, Ethan appeared, leading a wagon rather than his usual mount. "Evening, Clara," he called, his smile warming her despite her turmoil. "I was hoping to catch you before you closed. The Wilsons have invited us to dinner at the ranch tonight, and I've brought the wagon to drive you out if you're amenable." Clara hesitated. A dinner invitation suggested that the Wilsons saw them as a couple, a thought that both pleased and frightened her, especially in light of Abigail's warning. "I need to speak with you about something first," she said, her voice more strained than she intended. Ethan's expression immediately grew serious. "Of course, is everything all right?" Clara glanced around the busy street. "Not here. Can we go somewhere more private?" he nodded, helping her up onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. Instead of heading directly out of town, he guided the horses to a quiet spot along the creek that ran behind Lordsburg's small schoolhouse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. "What's troubling you, Clara?" Ethan asked once they were settled on a fallen log near the water's edge. Clara took a deep breath. "Abigail Taylor came to see me today. She said her father received a telegraph from Yuma making inquiries about you." She looked directly into his eyes. "She said there was trouble there. Something about a woman and missing money." To her surprise, Ethan didn't look shocked or defensive. Instead, a sad understanding crossed his features. "I wondered when that might surface," he said quietly. Clara's heart sank. "Then it's true." "Not in the way you're thinking," he replied, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of emotional distress. "There was trouble in Yuma, yes, but I wasn't the cause of it." "Tell me," Clara said simply. Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting to the creek flowing steadily past. "I was working as a foreman at the Blackwater Ranch outside Yuma. Had been there about 8 months. The owner, Harold Winters, was elderly and increasingly infirm. His niece, Margaret, came from back east to help manage things." His jaw tightened. "She took an interest in me that I didn't reciprocate. When I made it clear I wasn't interested in her advances, she became vindictive." "How so?" Clara asked, relief beginning to temper her anxiety. "Money went missing from the ranch accounts, quite a substantial sum. Margaret claimed she'd seen me in her uncle's study the night before, implied I'd taken it." His eyes met Clara's, unflinching. "I hadn't, of course, but her uncle believed her. There was no proof either way, just her word against mine. Sheriff didn't have enough to arrest me, but my reputation in Yuma was ruined, so I left and came to Lordsburg," Clara finished for him. "Eventually, yes. After a few months of ranch work in between, taking whatever jobs I could get." He sighed. "I should have told you about this sooner. I was afraid it would confirm all your worst suspicions about men being untrustworthy." Clara studied him, searching for any sign of deception. She found none. "Do the Wilsons know about this?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "I told Mr. Wilson the full story when he hired me. He was kind enough to judge me on my work rather than rumors." Clara nodded slowly, processing this information. "Thank you for being honest with me now." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "Clara, I have never lied to you, not about anything. I promised myself when I met you that whatever happened between us would be built on truth." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. "I believe you," she whispered, surprised to realize she meant it completely. Relief washed over his features. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, the setting sun painting the creek in shades of gold and copper. "We should head to the Wilsons if we don't want to be late for dinner," Clara finally said, though she made no move to rise. "We should," Ethan agreed, similarly stationary. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, sending pleasant shivers up her arm. "Clara, may I ask you something?" She nodded, suddenly breathless at the intensity of his gaze. "Have I made any progress at all in changing your mind about love?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Clara knew her answer would shape whatever came next between them. "Yes," she admitted softly. "More than I want to acknowledge, even to myself." A smile slowly spread across Ethan's face, transforming his features with hope. "That's all I needed to hear." To Clara's surprise, he didn't press for more, didn't try to kiss her or extract further confessions. Instead, he stood and offered his hand to help her up. "Come on, Mrs. Wilson makes a pot roast that's worth traveling for, and she'll be disappointed if we're late." As they rode to the Wilson ranch in the gathering dusk, Clara felt something shifting inside her, the walls she'd built so carefully beginning to crumble. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The dinner at the Wilsons was everything Clara might have hoped for: warm, welcoming, and mercifully free of obvious matchmaking. Though Mrs. Wilson's knowing smiles whenever she caught Ethan and Clara exchanging glances suggested her thoughts on the matter were clear enough. After dinner, Mr. Wilson invited them to the porch to enjoy the cool evening air and the spectacular view of stars over the ranch's expansive pastures. Clara found herself seated beside Ethan on a porch swing, a respectable distance between them but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. "Ethan tells me you've never seen a cattle drive, Miss Zimmerman," Mr. Wilson said, settling into a rocking chair with his pipe. "We're moving a small herd to the North Pasture day after tomorrow. Not a proper drive, but enough to give you a taste of ranch life if you'd care to observe." Clara glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with poorly concealed hope. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Wilson. If it wouldn't be an imposition." "Not at all," the older man exclaimed. "Martha would be delighted to have another woman around, wouldn't you, dear? Too much male company drives her to distraction." Mrs. Wilson laughed. "What my husband means is that I'd welcome your company while the men are busy playing cowboys. Perhaps you could stay the night. The guest room is always prepared." The invitation was generous and entirely proper, yet Clara felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of spending more time at the ranch, more time near Ethan. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I'd be honored to accept." On the drive back to town, Ethan seemed more relaxed than Clara had ever seen him, humming softly as he guided the horses along the moonlit road. "You seem happy," Clara observed, smiling at his evident good mood. "I am," he replied simply. "It was a good evening. And the prospect of showing you a bit of my world the day after tomorrow makes me happier still." "I'm looking forward to it," Clara admitted. "Though I confess I know very little about cattle," Ethan chuckled. "They're simple creatures at heart, not unlike men, some might say. They need food, water, space to roam, and occasionally a firm hand to guide them away from trouble." "Are you comparing yourself to a steer, Mr. Quinn?" Clara teased, surprising herself with her playfulness. "I'd prefer to think of myself as a cutting horse, intelligent, intuitive, and useful in a pinch," he replied with a grin. "Though I suppose that's for others to judge." They reached the millinery, and Ethan helped Clara down from the wagon, his hand strong and sure at her waist. He held her perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, their faces close in the darkness. "Thank you for believing me, Clara," he said softly. "About Yuma." "Thank you for giving me reason to," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, ever respectful of the boundaries she'd established. "Good night, Clara. Sleep well." As she watched him drive away, Clara realized with crystal clarity that she was falling in love with Ethan Quinn, despite all her determinedly practical resolutions to the contrary. The day of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the task ahead. Ethan arrived at the millinery early, helping Clara load her small overnight bag into the wagon. Mrs. Holloway, who had returned from Tucson the previous evening, watched with undisguised delight. "Don't worry about the shop, dear," she assured Clara. "Take your time and enjoy yourself. It's not every day a girl gets to see real cowboys at work." The drive to the Wilson Ranch was filled with Ethan's stories about cattle and ranch life, the rhythm of the seasons, the challenges of drought and predators, the satisfaction of seeing a healthy herd thrive under good stewardship. Clara found herself captivated, not just by the subject but by Ethan's evident passion for the work. "You truly love ranching, don't you?" she observed as they approached the Wilson property. "I do," Ethan confirmed. "There's something about it that gets into your blood. The connection to the land, the animals, the weather. It's a hard life but an honest one. And you still dream of your own place someday." His expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, though my dreams have expanded somewhat in recent months." Clara didn't ask what he meant, though her heart beat faster at the implication. Mrs. Wilson welcomed Clara warmly, showing her to the comfortable guest room where she could freshen up before the day's activities began. Through the window, Clara could see cowboys gathering in the yard, preparing horses and equipment. When she came downstairs, Mrs. Wilson handed her a sturdy straw hat. "To protect that fair complexion, my dear. The autumn sun can be deceptive." Clara thanked her, and they walked together to where Mr. Wilson was giving instructions to the assembled cowhands. Ethan stood slightly apart, already mounted on his bay gelding, looking every inch the capable foreman. His eyes found Clara's immediately, and the smile he gave her warmed her to her toes. Mr. Wilson finished his briefing and approached the women. "Martha, I've arranged for Miguel to drive you and Miss Zimmerman out to the ridge overlook. You'll have an excellent view of the drive from there, and it's a comfortable spot to watch from." Mrs. Wilson nodded approvingly. "Perfect. I've packed a picnic lunch for us." As the cowboys began to move toward their assigned positions, Ethan guided his horse over to Clara. "I'll be leading the right flank," he explained. "Keep those beeves moving in the proper direction. It's about 6 miles to the north pasture, so we should be there by early afternoon." "Be careful," Clara found herself saying. Ethan's expression softened. "Always am." "Enjoy the show, Miss Zimmerman." With a tip of his hat, he turned his mount and rode off to join the others. Miguel, a weathered ranch hand with a kind smile, helped the women into a small buggy and drove them to the ridge Mr. Wilson had mentioned. The elevation provided a spectacular view of the valley below, where the cattle were being gathered into a more organized formation. "It's rather like a dance, isn't it?" Clara observed as she watched the riders circling the herd, their movements precise and coordinated. Mrs. Wilson nodded. "A dance that's been performed since cattle were first domesticated, I imagine. There's an art to it that most people never appreciate." From their vantage point, Clara could easily spot Ethan, his form distinctive among the other riders. She watched in admiration as he guided his horse with minimal visible commands, anticipating the movements of the cattle with an intuitive grace. "He's quite skilled," she murmured, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until Mrs. Wilson responded. "One of the best I've seen, and I've been a rancher's wife for 30 years. The older woman gave Clara a sidelong glance. "A man with those kinds of skills would make a fine husband, capable, patient, firm when needed, but gentle by nature." Clara felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Mrs. Wilson, Oh, don't mind me, dear," Mrs. Wilson interrupted with a knowing smile. "Just an old woman thinking out loud. Though I will say this, I've never seen Ethan Quinn look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not in the 2 years he's worked for us." Clara didn't know how to respond, so she turned her attention back to the cattle drive in progress. The herd was moving now, a living river of brown and white flowing through the golden landscape, guided by the skilled riders on all sides. They followed the progress of the drive from their elevated position, occasionally relocating the buggy to maintain a good view. By midday, Mrs. Wilson unpacked their lunch: cold chicken, fresh bread, apples, and a flask of lemonade. They ate in companionable silence, watching the steady movement of the herd below. "Tell me, Clara," Mrs. Wilson said as they were packing away the remains of their meal, "what do you think of ranch life? Could you imagine yourself living it?" The question was loaded with implication, and Clara knew it. She considered her answer carefully. "It's beautiful," she began honestly. "There's a freedom to it that town life doesn't offer, and a connection to the rhythms of nature that seems grounding." She looked out over the vast landscape. "But it's also isolated, far from the conveniences and society of town." Mrs. Wilson nodded approvingly. "A thoughtful assessment. Ranch life isn't for everyone. It takes a certain strength of character and a willingness to find joy in simple things. Like watching a successful cattle drive." Clara suggested with a smile. "Exactly so. or a garden that produces despite the heat, or a home filled with love regardless of its size or grandeur. Mrs. Wilson patted Clara's hand. The right person makes any place feel like home, my dear. That's something I've learned in my many years. By mid-afternoon, the cattle had reached their destination, a sprawling pasture bordered by a creek on one side and gently rising hills on the other. Miguel drove the women down to where Mr. Wilson and the other ranchers were dismounting, their job complete. Ethan approached as Clara descended from the buggy, his face dusty but his smile bright. "What did you think?" he asked, removing his hat and wiping his brow with his sleeve. "It was magnificent," Clara replied sincerely. "Like watching a perfectly choreographed performance, except with very large, stubborn dancers." Ethan laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "That's a better description than most cowhands would give. They'd use considerably more colorful language." "I'm sure they would," Clara agreed with a smile. "You were impressive out there." The compliment brought a pleased flush to Ethan's face beneath the dust and sun. "High praise indeed, coming from you." They were interrupted by Mr. Wilson calling the hands together for a final review of the day's work. Ethan excused himself with reluctance, and Clara rejoined Mrs. Wilson, who was overseeing the preparation of the celebratory dinner that traditionally followed a successful drive. The evening that followed was filled with good food, music from a cowhand's fiddle, and stories around a massive bonfire. Clara found herself drawn into the camaraderie of ranch life, watching as Ethan interacted with the other workers respected as a leader, but clearly also considered a friend. As the night deepened and the hands gradually retired to the bunkhouse, Ethan approached Clara where she sat by the fire, wrapped in a shawl Mrs. Wilson had loaned her against the evening chill. "Walk with me," he asked quietly, offering his hand. Clara hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his. He led her away from the dying fire, toward a small rise where the moonlight illuminated the sleeping herd in the distance. "Thank you for coming today," Ethan said as they stood side by side, gazing out over the silvered landscape. "It meant a lot to me to share this with you." "Thank you for inviting me," Clara replied. "I've enjoyed it more than I expected to." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of the breeze through the grass. "Clara," Ethan began, his voice low and serious, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes." His eyes, silvered by moonlight, held hers with unwavering intensity. "I'm in love with you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned with flowery rhetoric or grand promises. "I know you said you were done with love," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "And I promised to respect that. But I also promised myself I'd be honest with you. I love you, Clara Zimmerman. I've loved you since that day in the line shack when you told me about your dreams of travel and books and a home of your own." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I'm not asking for declarations or promises. I just wanted you to know, whatever happens between us, whatever you decide, that's my truth." Clara studied his face in the moonlight, seeing nothing but sincerity in his expression. The walls she'd built around her heart seemed paper thin now, ready to dissolve at a touch. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, understanding. "I know. Loving someone is the bravest thing a person can do, and the most foolish." "Sometimes," he agreed with a soft laugh. "But all the best things in life require a bit of foolishness, don't they? Otherwise, we'd never leave safe harbors, never see what lies beyond the horizon." Clara thought of her dreams, travel, adventure, a business of her own. All requiring courage, all involving risk. "I told you once that I'd change your mind slowly," Ethan said, taking a careful step closer. "I meant it. I'll wait as long as you need, Clara. There's no rush." In that moment, looking into eyes that held such patience and such hope, Clara made a decision. She closed the distance between them and, standing on tiptoe, pressed her lips to his in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Ethan's arms came around her gently, one hand cradling the back of her head as he returned her kiss with restrained passion. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean your mind is changing?" he whispered, hope evident in every syllable. "It means," Clara replied softly, "that perhaps I've been a little hasty in my declarations about being done with love, at least where you're concerned, Ethan Quinn." His smile was brighter than the moon above them. "I can work with that, Clara Zimmerman. I can definitely work with that." They walked back to the ranch house hand in hand. A new understanding between them, the future suddenly full of possibilities neither had dared to imagine before. The weeks that followed were a revelation for Clara. For the first time in her life, she experienced courtship as it was meant to be built on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection rather than pretense or ulterior motives. Ethan was true to his word about changing her mind slowly. He never pressed for declarations or commitments beyond what Clara was ready to give. Their relationship progressed naturally, deepening with each shared experience and conversation. By the time Lordsburg's Harvest Festival arrived in late October, there was no longer any pretense that they were just friends. They attended together openly, Ethan proudly escorting Clara through the decorated town square, introducing her to ranchers and cowboys from the surrounding area, as if she were already a permanent part of his life. "People are talking," Clara observed as they sampled Mrs. Holloway's prize-winning apple butter at one of the festival booths. "Let them," Ethan replied with a shrug. "Unless it bothers you," Clara considered this. A month ago, the idea of being the subject of town gossip would have mortified her. Now, she found she cared far less about others' opinions. "No," she decided. "It doesn't bother me." Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "Good, because I plan to give them plenty more to talk about in the coming months." Before Clara could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by Sheriff Taylor, his expression unusually serious. "Quinn," he said with a nod. "Miss Zimmerman, might I have a word in private?" Clara felt Ethan tense beside her. "Of course, Sheriff. Is something wrong?" The lawman glanced around at the festival crowds. "Not here. My office, if you don't mind." They followed Sheriff Taylor to the jailhouse at the end of Main Street, Clara's mind racing with possibilities. Had something happened at the Wilson Ranch? Or was this about the rumors from Yuma? Once inside his office, Sheriff Taylor closed the door and moved behind his desk. "Got a telegraph from Yuma yesterday," he said without preamble, confirming Clara's fears. "About that business with Harold Winters and his missing money." Ethan straightened, his expression neutral but his eyes wary. "Yes." To Clara's surprise, the sheriff's stern expression broke into a smile. "Seems the old man's niece has confessed. Margaret Winters admitted to taking the money herself and falsely accusing you to cover her theft." Ethan stared at the sheriff, momentarily speechless. "She confessed," Sheriff Taylor nodded. "Apparently had a crisis of conscience when her uncle took ill last month. Thought he might die with that sin on her soul. He's recovered, but she came clean anyway. The sheriff in Yuma thought you'd want to know that your name's been cleared." Relief washed over Ethan's features. "I appreciate that, Sheriff, and I appreciate you telling us directly instead of letting it filter through town gossip." Sheriff Taylor grunted. "Figured you deserved that courtesy. You've proven yourself a good addition to this community, Quinn. Wanted you to know that whatever happened in Yuma, Your reputation here stands on its own merits." After they left the sheriff's office, Ethan led Clara to a quiet corner of the town square, away from the festival's bustle. His expression was a mix of relief, vindication, and lingering disbelief. "I never thought she'd admit it," he said, shaking his head. "I'd made my peace with carrying that shadow forever." Clara squeezed his hand. "I'm happy for you, Ethan, though I never doubted your innocence," he smiled, raising her hand to his lips. "I know. Your faith in me means more than any official clearing of my name." His expression grew thoughtful. "But I can't deny it feels like a weight has been lifted, like the last obstacle has been removed." "Obstacle to what?" Clara asked. Ethan's eyes met hers, intense and focused. "To building a future without shadows from the past." He took a deep breath. "Clara, there's something I've been wanting to show you. Would you ride out with me tomorrow? There's a place about an hour from town I'd like you to see." Curiosity piqued. Clara nodded. "Of course." The following day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for riding. Ethan arrived at the millinery just after breakfast, leading Daisy, who had become Clara's regular mount during their increasingly frequent rides together. They rode east from Lordsburg, following a trail that wound through rolling hills covered in autumn brown grass and scattered juniper. Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet, responding to Clara's questions about their destination with vague answers and slight smiles. After about an hour, they crested a rise to find a small valley spread before them. A clear creek cut through the center, its banks lined with cottonwood trees displaying the last of their golden leaves. On the eastern side, a modest homestead stood, a small cabin with a covered porch, a barn and corrals, all newly constructed but unpainted. "Ethan, what is this place?" Clara asked as they rode closer. He glanced at her, a mixture of nervousness and excitement in his eyes. "It's mine. Or it will be, once the final paperwork clears next week. 160 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, with water rights to the creek." Clara stared at him in astonishment. "You've bought a ranch, but I thought you were still saving." "I've been saving for 5 years," he explained as they dismounted near the cabin. "Plus the Wilsons gave me a bonus last spring after we increased their calf survival rate. I've been working on this place in my spare time for the past 2 months. That's why I couldn't call on you as often as I wanted to." "You built this yourself?" Clara asked, amazed as she looked at the sturdy cabin. "With some help from friends," Ethan admitted. "The foundation was already here, old homestead that was abandoned during the war. We salvaged what we could and rebuilt the rest." He led her up the steps to the porch. "Would you like to see inside?" Clara nodded, suddenly understanding why this place was so important to him. This was his dream made tangible, the future he'd been working toward for years. The cabin was simple but solidly constructed, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 doors leading to what Clara presumed were bedrooms. The furniture was minimal, a table with 4 chairs, a settee near the fireplace, and little else. "It's not much yet," Ethan said, watching her face anxiously. "But it's a start. The barn's ready for livestock, and I've already arranged to purchase 30 head of cattle in the spring. Mr. Wilson's letting me bring Maverick, my horse, and Daisy as part of my final payment." "It's wonderful, Ethan," Clara said sincerely. "A perfect beginning." Relief crossed his features. "I'm glad you think so, because—" He took a deep breath, reaching for her hands. "Clara, I brought you here today to ask if you'd consider making this your home too, as my wife." Though Clara had begun to suspect the purpose of this visit, hearing the actual proposal still took her breath away. Ethan continued, his words coming faster now, as if he feared she might interrupt. "I know it's not the grand house you deserve, or the life in a big city that might offer more opportunities. And I know your plans for the millinery are important to you. I wouldn't ask you to give those up. Lordsburg is close enough that you could still work with Mrs. Holloway if you wanted to. Or we could look at expanding into Tucson eventually, or even Clara silenced him with a finger to his lips, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Ethan Quinn, are you asking me to marry you? He nodded, his own eyes suspiciously damp. I am. I love you, Clara Zimmerman. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like, wherever it takes us. But only if it's what you want to. Clara looked around the simple cabin, seeing not what it was but what it could be, a home filled with love and laughter, a foundation for all the dreams they might share. Just as she'd told Ethan months ago, she didn't need a man to build a life worth living. But perhaps sharing that life with the right man might make it richer, fuller, more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. I once told you I was done with love, she said softly. That I couldn't risk my heart again. I remember, he replied, his voice equally soft. You said you'd change my mind slowly. A small smile touched his lips. I hoped I could. You have, Clara whispered, stepping closer to him. Completely and absolutely. Yes, Ethan Quinn, I will marry you. I will make this place our home. I will build a life with you, wherever it leads us. The joy that blazed across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance, before capturing her lips in a kiss that promised forever. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and breathless, Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I have something for you, he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. It was my mother's. My father gave it to her when they had nothing but dreams and each other. I've carried it since she died, waiting for the woman who would make me feel what he felt for her. He slid the ring onto Clara's finger, where it fit as if made for her. When I met you that day in the millinery, something told me you might be that woman. Even when you declared yourself done with love, something in me knew we were meant to find each other. Clara looked down at the ring, then up into the face of the man she loved. I think perhaps we were, she agreed softly, though I might have made the journey more difficult than necessary. Ethan laughed, pulling her close again. The worthwhile journeys are rarely easy, Clara Zimmerman, but they're always worth the effort. They were married on Christmas Eve in Lordsburg's small church, decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon for the holiday. Mrs. Holloway wept openly throughout the ceremony, while Mr. and Mrs. Wilson beamed like proud parents. Even Abigail Taylor attended, offering sincere congratulations and a handsome wedding gift of embroidered linens. As they exchanged their vows, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From declaring herself done with love to pledging her life to Ethan Quinn had been a path of gradual revelations about trust, about courage, about the kind of love that builds rather than destroys. Their wedding night was spent in their cabin, now furnished with wedding gifts and personal touches that made it truly a home. As snow fell gently outside, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, planning their future in whispered conversations that stretched until dawn. I was thinking, Ethan said, tracing lazy patterns on Clara's bare shoulder, that the spring calving season will keep us busy, but by summer we might consider a trip to San Francisco. The first of your travels. Clara smiled, nestling closer to her husband's warmth. I'd like that. And perhaps next year we could visit the East Coast. I've always wanted to see New York. Wherever you want to go, Clara Quinn, he replied, the new name still bringing a smile to both their faces. Though I hope you'll always want to come home to this valley. To me. Always, she promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. This is where my heart belongs now. With you. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Ethan taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony in the yard. Their daughter, Elizabeth, not yet a year old, slept peacefully in her cradle beside Clara's rocking chair. The ranch had prospered under Ethan's careful management, growing from the initial 30 head of cattle to over 200. The original cabin had been expanded to include 2 more bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and the wide covered porch where Clara now sat. True to their plans, they had traveled to San Francisco, to Chicago, even to New York City the previous year. But always, they returned to their valley, to the home they had built together. Clara had maintained her connection to the millinery, designing custom hats that Mrs. Holloway sold in the shop and traveling to Tucson quarterly to select fabrics and trimmings. It provided her with creative fulfillment and a modest income of her own, while still allowing her to be present for the daily life of the ranch and their growing family. As she watched Ethan's patient guidance of their son, Clara's heart swelled with a love so profound it sometimes still took her breath away. The woman who had once declared herself done with love now found her life saturated with it in her children's laughter, in the community they'd built around them, and most of all in the unwavering partnership she shared with her husband. Ethan looked up, catching her watching them. The smile he gave her still made her heart skip, even after 5 years of marriage. He said something to James, then lifted the boy from the pony and set him on the ground. As their son ran off to investigate something in the nearby flower bed, Ethan crossed the yard to join Clara on the porch. "What are you thinking about, looking so thoughtful?" he asked, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. Clara smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I was thinking about the day we met, about how determined I was never to risk my heart again." "And how persuasive I was," Ethan teased, bringing her hand to his lips. "You were," she agreed with a laugh, "though you kept your promise to change my mind slowly." He nodded, his expression growing serious. "The best things are worth waiting for, worth building carefully with patience and faith." Clara leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she once would have thought impossible. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me, Ethan Quinn." "Never," he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not then, not now, not ever." As the Arizona sun dipped toward the horizon, painting their valley in gold and amber, Clara silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought Ethan Quinn into her life, the man who had taught her that a heart once broken could not only heal but grow stronger, more capable of love than she had ever imagined possible. She had been done with love, but love, it seemed, had not been done with her. And for that, she would be eternally grateful.